Welcome to Compassionate Conversations. The goal of our podcast is to explore topics related to serious illness. Ancora Compassionate Care exists to be a supportive presence for life's journey. We can provide care and support wherever a patient may be on their journey with a serious illness. Ancora Compassionate Care began as Hospice of Rockingham County in 1987. While our name changed in late 2023, we are still the local provider the community has always known. We'll always be there because we've always been here. Welcome to this edition of Compassionate Conversations. My name is Lynn Flanagan and I'm the CEO at Ancora Compassionate Care. Christin Hunnicutt is joining me today and she is one of our grief services coordinator. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. We're going to get into some detail as far as age ranges when we're talking about grief and loss today. But as I was thinking about the program today, it dawned on me that probably some of our listeners may not realize that our support, our care for the families does not stop once their loved one has passed away. So before we talk about how grief and loss affect children, tell us a little bit about how your department takes care of families, basically how you pick up that relationship from when we have cared for the person passes away.
Sure. So there's times that we might get brought in to work with the families just to be additional support while they're in care.
Sure.
But afterward, we're there just to offer a listening ear, if that's all that someone needs. We offer counseling, we offer support groups. We have one-on-one counseling, Zoom counseling, telephone support, just whatever it is that family needs and however it's easiest to reach them. That's what we try to accommodate. We do also offer support through school systems and grief camps and different things like that. We try to tailor support needs based on that family and the individuals in that family.
Yeah. So that continues from the care we provide in hospice care that's very individualized. So that's wonderful to know that it's there really is no such thing as cookie cutter support.
That's right.
It's whatever that particular family unit needs.
That's right.
That is pretty awesome. So what would a family expect as far as timing? Like, when do you first reach out?
Yeah. So I initially will call the families usually about a week or so after the death. I find that in the first week there's so much busyness that it's hard to really know how they're coping. So usually after about a week, between a week and 2 weeks is when we make that first call. And that's just to introduce myself and support's available and just kind of build some relationship just to see what the needs are of that person, of others in the family, and just how we might be able to help.
Okay. What I wanted us to focus on today is how grief and loss may affect children. Of course, thinking about any of us, no matter what our age, we're all going to go through an experience like this very individually, and coping is going to be different, all of that. But some of this is very age specific,
right?
Correct? So let's think about younger children, like elementary age children. If you were to make contact with a family, and let's say we had one or two, and we'll have a hypothetical situation. Let's say they've lost their grandfather that they were very close to. What are some of the things that you are looking for? What are you listening for when you're doing an assessment?
So, like you said, everyone copes differently, processes a little bit differently, but there are some basics that are the same. So I might look for, how are they eating? How are they sleeping? Are they showing anxiety? Are they showing, sometimes young children might be afraid of, granddad passed, who might pass next? So they might have fears around that or their own health. They might have, issues with confusion or there's so many things that I might look for. But I'm really looking for how's the family supporting each other? Is that child able to, name what they're feeling, express what they're feeling, be able to use supports and look for some of those kind of physical symptoms that I listed.
Okay. And I guess a lot of it would depend too on the relationship that the child had with the person who passed away.
Yeah.
Maybe what role that person played in their life. I would imagine somebody that lived next door and maybe grandpa picked them up from school or took them to the bus stop, whatever the case may be. That may be different than someone whose grandparent lived a few states away and they just see them a couple of times a year.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. It sometimes can come across as selfish, but it's really not selfish. It's self-reflective, the way that children process, and it is that role. So now that granddad passed, if he is the one that picked them up from school, who's going to do that for me now? There's a lot of families now that live with, multi-generational homes, and maybe the grandparents lived in the home, and granddad read me my bedtime stories. Who's going to read to me now? So it can sometimes sound kind of selfish, but that child really needs to know that those roles will still be filled and that their needs will still be met.
Okay. So how do you go about helping? Because when you think about this whole scenario, the grown-ups in the home that are there to help the children, name the feelings, help them process, they're grieving themselves. So how do you help the grown-ups help the child?
Yeah. So interestingly, I do meet with families at times, but a lot of times I meet with the parents and try to equip them to help their children. I really think they're the expert in their children. And I can help them along the way, give resources, suggest books, journals, activities, things like that. But I do try to help the parents process their grief a little bit while they're also observing their children and meeting their needs, because you really do need to take care of yourself to take care of others.
Right. And that's the first thing that kind of came to my mind. I thought, golly, especially if you've been the caregiver for the person who passed away, so physically exhausted, maybe emotionally exhausted, but it's wonderful that you can equip them. That is still supporting the grown-up in their grief, but giving them some ideas as to how to help their children. So let's look at, we've got 6 specific things here, 6 ways that grief and loss may affect children. So I would just like us to start at the top here with number 1. So academically, what might you see?
So children that are school age, well, really adults experience this too, that after a loss, sometimes you might have trouble with memory, focus, just the ability to concentrate might be impacted. And so a lot of times children are expected to sit in their seats all day long, fully focused, fully attentive. And if you have a thought pop in your head and you're all of a sudden grieving this memory inwardly, you're going to be distracted, and that's just natural.
Sure.
And so you might see a time where academics might slip a little bit. I always encourage families to be open with the schools and let the schools know what's going on. Not all children want their peers to know about the loss. There's some children that are selective with, and adults too, selective with who you open up to. But I do encourage that the guidance counselor is aware and the teachers are aware, so that they can look for, any concerns that might show up in the classroom if suddenly grades are slipping or behavior changes.
Well, that makes sense. So then there would be a reason, so to speak, for all of that. And everybody, I know you certainly cannot put a timeline on anything like this, but so I would think it would be reasonable that it may slip. Academics may slip, may get a little bit better, and potentially slip again.
Yeah, grief has ups and downs for kids just like us.
Yep. And
also to let the school know if your child needs a bereavement day here and there, just to let the school know. And a lot of times they'll make that an excused absence, and they might even offer some extra tutoring or help getting homework caught up if needed.
I have not even thought about that, because you think about adults in the workplace, we certainly have bereavement leave. I have never even thought about that, but children would need the same thing.
They do.
Okay. So some of this kind of goes hand in hand, but let's talk a little bit about confusion that you may see as far as how grief and loss affect children.
Yeah. So confusion is really around the language used around death. I think times that adults are trying to talk to children about death, they try to use gentle words like they're gone or they're sleeping or things like that. That's very confusing for children. Depending on their age, they might feel like, oh, they're asleep, then they'll wake up.
Right.
Or they might flip it to anxiety and feel like, well, if I go to sleep, am I ever going to wake up?
Right.
So the language is really important to not cause confusion. And it can be hard for adults to use those concrete words like death and died and those kinds of words with their children, but it really is important for them to really grasp the permanence of the loss.
And again, certainly age, that's age dependent with what they can understand.
Right.
But I remember someone telling me one time that their child really had a lot of difficulty. They thought they were using the, quote, the right words, and they had told the child that, he's gone to a better place.
Right.
And it really kind of backfired. It was almost like, well, what's wrong with our place? And
He doesn't want to be with me anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. So
and there's another part of confusion too that I had just thought of that just my own childhood memory actually just came to mind. But sometimes the rituals around death can be confusing, and the funerals and the wakes and the memorials and the celebrations of life after, all of these things can feel really confusing to kids. Just to share a personal story, when my granddad passed, that was the first loss that I'd experienced. And we went to the funeral, the viewing and the funeral, and it was somber as expected, and people were sharing stories. Well, then my family's Irish, so we went to the wake afterward, and everyone was celebrating and laughing. And I was so confused by that, and no one had prepared me for those traditions. And this is how we mourn, but we also celebrate their life. And that was very confusing to me. So it's important to share, kind of prepare your kids for what to expect as well.
Well, that makes perfect sense. And just have an explanation before you get to each. I can see how that would be very, very confusing. So another way that grief and loss can affect children, of course, with maybe physical complaints and different emotions that you may see. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so all of us are very complex. We have social needs, emotional needs, cognitive needs, physical needs, and grief shows up in all of those places. And so we might need to look for, physical and emotional signs might show up at like stomach aches, headaches, difficulty sleeping. There might be behavioral outbursts or kids have a hard time understanding mixed emotions and how you can feel mixed emotions at the same time and just don't know how to handle that. And so that can come out in physical ways and, emotional outbursts as well.
And I would think it would be important not to discount anything, because to the child it is very real. If you have a tummy ache, or if you are sad one minute and then the next minute there's a totally different swing as far as emotions go. And so you think about what we've talked about already, so academics, confusion, and now this, so these big feelings would also show up at school. So in my mind, another reason to be open with the child's teacher or school counselors and let them know what's going on. So
Absolutely.
They don't think it may be something else, I guess.
And there's some really great books to help parents along this, to help kind of normalize those experiences for their kids, because it can be overwhelming to know how do you ask your child, I know you're saying you have a headache, do you think it's because of this? And when they may not be able to identify that. And so there's some books that you can read that can help kind of normalize the experience, but also encourage them to talk, which can reduce those experiences going forward.
Okay. When would you get concerned? When may a family or parent or grandparent, guardian, when may they need some extra support if it feels like these physical symptoms are prolonged? I mean, are there things like that to look for?
Well, if there's a significant change in eating, sleeping, anxiety, regression of behaviors, things that seem to be significant, I would expect to have changes in that in the first several weeks, but once you've processed through the services and you've returned to school and kind of returned to routine, if they're not able to return back to routine, and expect ups and downs, like we said, but if they're in general really not able to function back in their regular routines, I would absolutely reach out for help. Okay. But I would also just encourage, sometimes parents just need encouragement that what they're doing is right. And it is such an overwhelming time that, if you have any questions, just reach out and say, this is what's going on. This is what we've been doing. Does this feel normal to you? And we can be there to provide support or just encouragement.
Okay. So we've got some words here that are they're strong words for me. So guilt and shame. How does those two words, how do they show up with grief and loss in children?
So there can be guilt, shame, regret, all those feelings that adults have, kids can have them too. You may feel guilty that maybe your loved one was in the hospital and you didn't go to visit to say goodbye. You just didn't think you could see them, so you didn't go, and you might feel guilty for that, or you might feel regret for that. There's times where maybe there was a disagreement with a loved one.
Right.
And the child thought, I wish you would just go away. Well, that's not wishing a death.
Right.
We know that. But then if a death occurs, then they might feel like, I wished this to happen, and they can feel guilty over that. And so there's different ways that guilt, shame, regret might show up for kids, just the same as it would for adults.
Okay. And the same with isolation. This is the fifth thing we've got here on the list. So, you mentioned earlier that some people, are relatively private. They may not want their peers to know, and that is certainly understandable. But it may be because maybe they think nobody else has had the same feelings or the same experience. But that by itself may be kind of isolating, I would think.
It could be, and that's why it is important to keep talking to your children and keep observing their behaviors. You would know ahead of time if they're a child that's more reserved and a little bit more private. So if they continue to only kind of reach out to maybe their siblings or one friend or a cousin, or they have kind of a smaller trusted group that they open up to, then they probably would have shown that beforehand. If there's a change where they used to have, they talk to anybody, and now all of a sudden they just want to stay in their room and they're not talking, that would definitely be concerning. But if they are someone who was reserved to begin with and they seem to be more so, then that would also be concerning. So just to keep talking to your kids, let them know, this is what I'm seeing, this is normal. Sometimes when I feel that way, this is what I do. Try to kind of model how to process and express grief with them, and that can make them not feel so alone and less likely to isolate themselves.
One thing that came to mind thinking about isolation and how to combat that is our grief camps that we have experienced in the past. It was always amazing to me that it was almost like an instant bond with other children. So you see some children show up to camp, and of course they may not know anybody else, but the minute we're in small group or somebody learns that, hey, this person lost their granddad too, I'm not the only one. You could almost see the light bulb with some kids come on. It's like, hey, I'm not the only one that's had this experience, that has felt this sad or anything. So it's just instant support when you find out somebody else.
And it's a way to feel like you're not alone, but it can also be encouraging. In our camps, we buddy up older children with younger children. So we have high school age with the younger children. And so they can see, oh, they've been through a loss and they're doing okay. This is how they've, coped, and this is how they're carrying their memories forward. And so they can see they're okay. I'm going to be okay too. It can be really encouraging. But also things like music or movies can also be a way to not feel so alone and to feel like, other people have gone through this. I'm not alone in this. I'll get through this. We're going to be showing the movie Onward this week to our our grief camp. And so that is a way to, I know it's a cartoon, but for children, they're watching the story and realizing, oh, they lost their father, and this is how these brothers band together and connected and got stronger and processed. And so, movies, music, and friends, camps, all those kinds of things can be really great tools.
So do you ever see, you mentioned the older children, and I think about always reaching around to help somebody else. So even going through a painful experience, a hard loss, but you can eventually one day maybe turn around and provide support for someone else. But every loss, in my mind, can equip you for the next one, because unfortunately we're all going to experience that and lose people that we love. So as you go through this, and the things that they learn, things that parents learn, can actually help them cope when the next loss
It
comes down the road.
It definitely does. You learn coping strategies as you go through life, and you pick up new tools and new ways to grow in supports, grow in faith, grow in coping strategies. All these things that we just continue to grow as people. So we're able as adults to kind of share those tools with children, but children continue to carry those on as they get older as well. There are times, however, that a second loss may occur down the road, and the adults do this as well, but sometimes children might feel like, I didn't grieve as hard for the second loss as I did the first one, and then that can be, we talked about guilt and shame, and sometimes that can bring in guilt to say, does that mean that I didn't love them as much? Why didn't I grieve it? And it's not that at all. It's exactly what you said, that they had learned the tools to cope better the following losses.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about 5 things. We've talked about how this may show up in their academic life. There may be some confusion, may have big feelings that they're not quite sure about, physical complaints. Just mentioned the guilt and shame, isolation, but maybe some worsening of some pre-existing challenges.
Yeah, so it's very common for children to regress for a time, where they might suddenly just start acting younger, doing things that you feel like, they're too old for this. We've moved past this stage, and they may regress for a time. But there's also, if they already had difficulty in school, adding loss to it with all the confusion and all the physical symptoms and all of that to it, it's going to make school that much harder. So they're probably going to have a harder time for a while anyway. If they already have some amount of anxiety, you might find that it's heightened for a time. I would encourage, if mental health was a concern, just to continue to learn the strategies to help. If it's anxiety, if it's depression, the strategies that have worked will continue to work. You just might need to remind them that they have those tools to keep using.
So maybe if you're talking with a family and this comes up, maybe that in my mind is something to really clue the parents into early. That if their children already have, whether it's anxiety, maybe they have trouble with friendships, trouble at school, something like that, to really watch them maybe a little bit closer than a child that doesn't have a pre-existing challenge like that.
I agree.
So as far as support groups, we mentioned Camp Good Grief that we have once a year. Are there other resources that you point families towards for children with grief and loss in particular?
So I often direct them to their schools. Their school guidance counselor can either meet with them, or most schools have some sort of counseling that they can also offer and bring into the school as well, which, the kids are in school most of their day, so that's the easiest way to reach them. But there's also a huge amount of online resources. It sounds funny, but even Sesame Street has fantastic resources for all ages, not just preschool age like you would think of. But there's so many online resources and activity booklets and things and books and journals and things that I would share with families.
Okay. So that was one of the things I really wanted our listeners to understand and go back to. Your support is a very individualized support. So depending on the age of the children, maybe even the number of children, I don't know, but how they're doing with these 6 things that we've talked about, then you tailor the resources, whether they be online or books or whatever, and let them know.
Okay. We try to get to know the family and the child and what needs they have, and we just try to help fill in the gaps and direct to resources that they need.
Okay. So how long does this support from your department continue on?
Well, it's an interesting question. So technically, as it's written, it's 13 months.
Right.
But as far as we're concerned, if anybody needs support, we're here.
Right.
So, I don't turn the families away. If something comes up, we all know grief has ups and downs, and it doesn't go away.
Right.
And so there may be a time, another loss may come up down the road in 2 years, or some other occurrence may just trigger grief memories again and things that need to get processed through, and we're still there.
fabulous point to end on. So I appreciate you being here with me today. So something that's very important that we want to stress to our viewers and to our listeners is exactly what Christin just said, is that Ancora Compassionate Care is always here. So she was referencing the Medicare regulation that says when we have cared for someone under our hospice care program, that then we follow them for 13 months after the death of their loved one. But clearly, the support lasts as long as the family or the children need it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Compassionate Conversations. If you ever need any more information about any of our services, so that may be hospice care, serious illness care, or grief and bereavement, as Christin and I have talked about today, you can give us a call at 336-427-9022, or you can visit our website at ancoracc.org.